Thank you very much for the invitation to come up here and to be the patron of the Miriam Rose Foundation. It's very flattering for a white fella from the south to be invited up to be a patron of such an august organisation here. And I pay particular tribute, of course, to Miriam Rose, who I've been privileged to know for over 30 years. I join with you in acknowledging the Larrakia people, the traditional owners of this place. Whenever I think about the Larrakia people being traditional owners, I often think back to the bark petitions signed in 1963 out there in Yirrkala. And when you look at what was written in those petitions, one of the statements was to the government down in Canberra saying, we don't want to become like the long grasses, the Larrakia there in Darwin. And what was being said, I think, was that out there in Yirrkala, the white man had only come really in the 1930s. And they'd been fairly benign Methodist missionaries. And so there hadn't been the sort of invasion there had been in Darwin, which had affected the long grasses, the Larrakia people. And I think that's something of the image that we hold tonight when we come and consider this topic. One of the images which has been with me all day, particularly seeing the video of Miriam that we've just seen, we saw it earlier in the day. I was privileged to be there in November 1986 in Alice Springs when the Pope held up the little boy from Daly River, Miriam's nephew. And you'll all remember that. It was a wonderful image because the protocol officers had told the organisers that the Pope was not allowed to wear any distinctive dress. He just had to be there in all white. But then the Aboriginal organisers came forward, you'll remember, and put the stole and the beanie on. And what colours were they? Black, red and gold. And the message was beamed to the world. And then Louise Pandella was inched forward and held out the little baby boy. And of course the Pope held him up and it became one of the great images of the world. I was giving some lectures in the United States at the time that Pope John Paul II died. And he died in the middle of the night in the United States. And I woke up and I turned on the television, and what was the image they were showing on American television? Pope John Paul II holding up that little baby boy. And that was the image that spoke to the nations of the world. I've been a white fella from a fairly privileged background in Australia, and I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, I'm just a human rights lawyer and a priest. I don't know very much about understanding Indigenous youth self-harm, but I think a lot of it is to do with different worldviews. Let me tell just a couple of stories about that. I remember in 1988, I was up here in the top end. There was an Irish priest who used to make documentaries for Irish television. And he was coming out to make 2 films for Irish television on the Australian bicentennial. One was going to be on Aborigines, and the other was going to be on the Irish in Australia. Well, he ended up making 3 documentaries about Aboriginal Australia, and one about the Irish in Australia. Now, I know there's someone here, isn't there, from the Tiwi Islands? One day we were across there and there was a man by the name of Aloysius, I remember his name. I think he was playing a trick on us, I'll tell you why. This Irish priest, he had read about how the Aboriginal people there used to like going up into the mud flats and finding the mangrove worm and eating the mangrove worm. So Aloysius took us on a wild goose chase right upstream where the mud literally came up to your thighs. And so we were stepping through with the big TV camera and the sound equipment and everything. And finally Aloysius found a rotten tree log with a large succulent mangrove one. And so it was all set up, and the priest Joe Dunn said, so now we'll take a shot of you picking up the worm. And so Aloysius, who was there with his mate, they started to roll the film. Aloysius leant down, picked up the succulent worm, and went to break it in two and to give it half to his mate. And Joe Dunn called out, "Cut, cut!" And Aloysius looked at him and said, "What?" And Aloysius said, "What's happening?" And the film director said, "I just want one continuous motion." He wanted him to pick up the worm and put it straight in his mouth. And Aloysius said, "But we share." And Joe Dunn said, "I don't want you to share. I just want one continuous motion." Now, I told that story at an educational conference not very long after. And an educational psychologist came up to me after and he said, "That's a brilliant story." I said, "I know it's a brilliant story. It's a good, simple story. Everyone understands." He says, "No, what you don't understand is it highlights the two different views of the world in educational theory." I said, "Oh, really? What are they?" He said, "There's the relational view and the transactional view. The relational view is that meaning comes from our relations with each other. Aloysius saying, we share. The transactional view, it's not about relationships, it's about what I want to achieve, what has to be done. I want to make a film, therefore I don't want you to share. What gives value is the transaction of what you want to achieve. Two completely different worldviews. Now, I don't know, it might be just pop psychology, but I reckon a lot of young Indigenous people who are locked in a cycle of self-harm, I reckon a lot of it is to do about living in two different worlds. Two different worldviews of transaction and relationships. As Miriam well knows, one of the greatest anthropologists we ever had in Australia, Professor W.E.H. Stanner. He gave evidence along with the Bernts in the big famous case Molucca and Nabalco up there in 1971-72 when the people at Yirrkala said, we don't want to become like the long grasses. We want to claim ownership of our land. Stanner had done most of his anthropological work not up around Yirrkala, but at Keats and Daly River. And Stanner once wrote a very fine essay where, a bit like the relational view and the transactional view, he said, if you wanted to design two systems of thought as different from each other as possible, while they still had to be held together, he said you would design the European and the Aboriginal. He said, what's the European about? The European is always about looking to the future. And what gives value to what you're doing in the present is what you're about in the future. What's education about? Look, kid, it's good for you because in the future you will be able to do this. You take out an insurance policy, why? Because in the future there might be an accident and you'll need to do something about it. He said that's the European Western perspective, looking to the future. He was the one who first used the phrase the dreaming in English. He said, what's the dreaming about? It's not about the future, it's about the past. What gives value to the present? That we are living out those relationships from the past. The tradition, the stories, the connection to country. And once again, I think a lot of young people who are holding together these two different worldviews. So, that's part of the challenge which is before us. I, a few years ago, was privileged to run what was called a National Human Rights Consultation for the Rudd government. And we had a fair bit of money to get out and do a lot of research. We went out and we asked people, what are the groups whose human rights are most in need of protection in contemporary Australia? I thought it was fairly heartening to see that Australians are not uncaring. And look, over 70% of Australians, look at the top three groups there. People with mental illness, the elderly, and people with a disability. Okay? Now, just come down in terms of tonight's topic and see that 57% thought that Indigenous people in remote areas did not have their human rights adequately protected. What was interesting to note is if you go down two more, Indigenous people in urban areas, only 33% thought that their human rights were not adequately protected. So I think in the Australian community now, there's a sense that there's a difference between the life experience and expectations of Aboriginal people in remote communities and those who are living in our towns and cities. As I often say, one of the things about contemporary Australia, for the first time, we now have an emerging Aboriginal middle class. And that's a good thing. But they're people who live in the towns and the cities. Those who, if you like, have been left behind in terms of human rights protection are those who are living in remote areas. Just as an aside, not relevant to tonight's topic, but just have a look at asylum seekers there, third from the bottom. You want to know why it's always an election issue? There it is. The only issue that divides the Australian community straight down the middle. Slightly more think that the human rights of asylum seekers are too well protected over against those who think they're not adequately protected. Just a couple more points I'd like to make in terms of criminal justice and the topic that we're considering tonight. As you all know better than I, the crime statistics for the Northern Territory are dreadful. And if we look, for example, at the fact that the national adult imprisonment rate in Australia is 111 per 100,000. The rate in the Northern Territory is 825 per 100,000. If you are living in the Northern Territory, you are 8 times more likely to be in jail than any other Australian. But we've got to put that together with one other horrific statistic. On a daily average in the Northern Territory, there are 1,411 adult prisoners. And what percentage of those are Aboriginal? 83.8%. So those two statistics give us the whole story. What then is the role of criminal justice in confronting the situation of young Indigenous people, usually young Indigenous men, as they wrestle with trying to make sense of their world? I, as a young lawyer, was involved in the case of an Aboriginal man who killed his lady back in 1981 up at Weipa in far north Queensland. It was called the Alwyn Peter case. And I remember in that case I was led by the leading criminal lawyer in Queensland. His name was Des Sturgis. And we presented a very complex case about the causes and effects of this sort of criminal behaviour. And we called everyone, including the legendary Professor Stanner. In fact, shortly after that, Stanner died, and I was privileged to receive the last letter Stanner ever wrote. But in that case, Sturgis got up and he told the judge, he said that the homicide rate on these remote Aboriginal communities was the highest amongst any ghetto group in the Western world. And he said words which I've never forgotten. He said, "Your Honour, I should tell you, Alwyn Peter and Deirdre Gilbert, who was the young lady, said, Owen Peter and Deirdre Gilbert were shaped by life on an Aboriginal reserve community, and each in their own way was destroyed by it. He said, and I should tell you, to be a member of such a community, one does not have to be bad or mad, one has only to be Aboriginal. And for 30 years, our courts have been trying to work out what is right, just and fair in terms of the sentencing of people like Owen Peter. And just 2 weeks ago, the High Court of Australia visited the issue in 2 cases called Munda and Bugme. And basically what the High Court has said is that the principles of sentencing are the same that apply to everybody. But when you come to apply those principles to Aboriginal people in these disadvantaged circumstances, then of course there will be different outcomes. And that is what justice demands. When I was involved in the Owen Peter case, at the end of it, a librarian, a white woman in Canberra, said to me, you had a big win in that case. I said, yes. She said, the only thing you succeeded in doing was taking away the protection of the white fella law for Aboriginal women living on these communities. And the High Court of Australia the other day, in dealing with the issue, said that it is necessary for the courts to respect the human dignity of both the victim and the person who is accused of the crime. And to do that, there has to be an acknowledgement of the preponderance of these violent offences which are occurring. So, to conclude, there is no way that the whitefella legal system is going to alleviate the situation of Indigenous youth self-harm. It's a long journey, it requires moral courage and, as Miriam Rose said, the holding. The holding particularly of the young men, it would seem, as they deal with those 2 worlds, the relational and the transactional, holding together the future and the past to give meaning. So, that's enough from me, and I'd now like to hand over to Ernest, who is far more expert in these matters than I will ever be.